South Carolina has a dark obsession bubbling under the surface that is rarely discussed. We're talking about organized animal fights, hundreds of cocks and dogs killed in brutal contests. But things are starting to change after a dedicated dogfighting unit was established at the state's highest law enforcement agency. Last year alone, more than 200 dogs were rescued from criminal competitions. But for most of these dogs, by the time they are rescued, it's already too late. Live 5 reporter Gracie Kirshner is joining me now with her latest reporting. Gracie, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's talk about why we're doing this story now. I know that this is one of those issues that's near and dear to your heart.
I actually have 3 rescue dogs at home. If I could have 100, I would. And my mom and I always talk about getting more. But these dogs, they just come from these horrible conditions. My own being part of that problem, and just seeing them learn to be around other dogs and interact in our own house has made me feel really passionate about things like this.
Now, part of the reason why you're doing this story now, though, is because we did recently see a major dog fighting ring bust here, even in just the last month.
Yeah, in October, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division actually rescued 47 dogs and arrested 4 people out in Lancaster. But the dogs were not just fighting. They were fighting in some terrible, deplorable conditions. They were living inside of plastic jugs and makeshift shelters, chained up to poles. They were working out on treadmills to condition the dogs. And there was just so much that was happening in a multi-site investigation that occurred. And what the Humane and Welfare Animals says is that this is actually the 4th one they've done in South Carolina in a few months, and they've rescued 88 animals. And the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division has rescued way more than just that.
Yeah, they actually described the conditions as, they said they found dogs straining against heavy chains around their necks or curled up dejectedly in plastic barrels or other kinds of makeshift shelters. Certainly not, the couch or the nice dog beds that many of us have for our pets. Now, we know that when it comes to these kinds of cases, it can be difficult to try because of the evidence, but also it feels like the legal system is not quite on the same page as our more modern priorities to break up some of these rings. And I know that was the focus of your latest reporting. Let's take a listen to that now.
What a dog can't say, its scars will show.
Scarring all around the face, all right here, all around the front of the legs. Dogfighting has been around forever. Trying to prosecute them has been forever. It's really hard to prosecute animal cases because your victims can't speak. And that's where that veterinary forensic plays into it. It gives that animal a voice through using their body, the evidence on their body as their voice.
Aldwin Roman is a certified animal investigator here in Charleston. Roman says major dogfighting busts are typically associated with bigger problems.
Someone who's going to hurt an animal is probably also willing to hurt a person, and with these dogfighting investigations, it's beyond that. It involves, drug trafficking, illegal gambling, illegal transport of animals, illegal possession of weapons.
That was the case back in October in Orangeburg, when SLED rescued 24 pit bulls and found large quantities of illegal and deadly drugs, weapons, vehicles, and cash. But beyond the crimes, the impact on the dogs is long-lasting and sometimes everlasting.
For a lot of these dogs, I think, probably over 50% of them, it doesn't always end up being a good outcome because they're just too dangerous. They're going to hurt somebody else's family if they get out of where they're living. They're going to hurt somebody else's dog, and it's just too risky.
Since SLED launched its dogfighting unit in 2023, Governor Henry McMaster has made conquering this crime a priority, even requesting $500,000 in funds to support the care of the animals SLED rescues. While these efforts have significant impacts in cracking down on the crime itself, Roman says while helpful, it's not enough.
We don't have room for not only an additional 30, 40 dogs, but 130, 40 dogs that are highly aggressive towards other animals. And then you have to hold them for much longer because these are criminal cases. It's not fair to the animal. It just completely breaks shelter. So it is something we are trying to work on.
Gracie, I think when we hear about these dogs getting rescued from these rings, we all kind of cheer and we are happy that they're finally, free from these criminal competitions. But the reality here, as alluded to by Roman, is that it's much more grim for them even after the fact. What really goes on once these dogs have been rescued?
What's unfortunate is that the rescuing is really just the first part. These dogs then need a lot of rehabilitation, some of which sometimes it doesn't work. I mean, Roman told me 50% of these dogs may not even see outside of the shelter walls. Some of them may have to be put down because they're just too dangerous to the community. They're just too aggressive. And one thing, he said the most heartbreaking part is that you'll see that these dogs love humans. It's part of their nature as dogfighting dogs. They love people. They're so sweet to people, usually very docile. But when they get around other dogs, they're too difficult to control. And say they are let out into the community, they are adopted out, it could be a risk to neighbors, it could be a risk to neighbors' pets, to other stray animals in the community. And at the end of the day, the risk is just too much than the reward of having that dog find a loving home.
Well, and even if they could find a loving home, there's a legal aspect to this as well, where some of these dogs, they can't be adopted because they are evidence, right?
Yeah, I mean, some of these dogs, their bodies serve as the evidence. That was part of the focus of my story. Forensic veterinary science makes a huge part in these investigations because, again, who are you supposed to talk to when your victims can't speak to you? So really, the cuts and scars and gaping wounds on their bodies serve as the evidence in these cases. They use them to figure out how long they were abused, how many times they fought. And each individual animal actually is its own charge. That was something I was wondering about. And Roman explained to me that if they find 400 dogs, they're going to test each individual one and use their bodies as evidence. Part of that means, though, they can't leave the shelter until the case is over. And we know that sometimes could take years.
Yeah, we know the South Carolina legal system oftentimes moves slowly. And if the evidence isn't crystal clear, and often in these cases, there's a lot of complicating factors. Even if it's not the dogs themselves, it's the additional charges, the gun charges or the drug charges or whatever it is that they're also charged with, that can make proceeding with the legal case a very slow process. 3-4 years to get through a lot of these cases. That means it's 3-4 years that a dog is kind of stuck in limbo. But we also are in a state where the legal system hasn't caught up to the current priorities. This wasn't in your reporting, but what have you found out about where our laws stand and how sometimes justice doesn't always feel all that just?
So the maximum penalty for animal cruelty here is 5 years in prison. When you think about those dogs, some of them suffer 10, 15 years of abuse for each individual one. Say you have 47 of them, that means you're spending 5 years in prison for 47 lives that are kind of being affected by this. But beyond that, actually, beyond dogfighting even, dogfighting is a felony here in South Carolina, but cockfighting is a misdemeanor. And in some cases, Roman tells me that is less of a penalty than a speeding ticket here in South Carolina. I mean, if you look at the South Carolina mascot for the school, it's cocky. It's a cock that's ready to fight. So if you will just kind of think about that in the sense of we're really behind on those things. And beyond that, actually, we are only one of 8 states here in the United States that doesn't have a rule in place for people that have these charges to be able to adopt again. So say you do abuse these animals, you are then able to get another dog. But 42 states in the U.S., they have a ban on that.
Animal cruelty is one of those things that I think politicians are kind of getting on board with. We know Representative Nancy Mace has called for, and if she were to become governor, would want to implement a animal abuse registry, much like the sex offender registry. We'll see if that goes through. But have you heard from any lawmakers or politicians or leaders in our state that are working to change the legal side? We know the governor is obviously in charge of this and implemented this dog fighting task force, but what about on the legal side? Any legislative efforts that you've heard of?
There is a push to make attending these dog fights no longer a misdemeanor and actually a felony. Because again, the more interest that these dogfights are getting, the more money they're making, and the more they're going to continue this. So if we stop it at its root and stop the business from occurring, there's a push kind of to get that charge changed. Make it a felony to go to these. Make it a felony to support this habit.
Now, the silver lining here is that it feels like the public opinion on animal fighting has been changing quite a bit. And I think that it is becoming much more unacceptable, socially unacceptable. But, beyond the law enforcement efforts here, culturally speaking, what else is happening both from sort of the nonprofit side, but also on that cultural side as well?
Here in Charleston County, I mean, we are over capacity. Beyond Charleston County, Berkeley County, Dorchester County, statewide, the shelters are over capacity with these dogs that they're rescuing, that are getting dropped off, that they're finding as strays. So in South Carolina, it's been something that both nonprofits and our county shelters and county governments are working to address. One thing that I know the Charleston Animal Society is working on is building kind of a disaster shelter, not only for those natural disasters. You see a lot of dogs be dropped off ahead of hurricanes and snowstorms and things like that, but for these large scale efforts to bust these dogs. Because, for example, they have 300, 400 dogs. They're already teeming. But when you get 47 more dogs, they obviously are going to do everything they can to save them. But sometimes they just don't have the space.
So they are building that or attempting to build that new facility for specifically these instances. Then there's also an effort to get the community on board, and that's through tips, right?
So one thing that Roman told me is that with every investigation that he's been a part of, it's all started from tips. It started from members of the community calling, wondering what's going on at their neighbor's house, kind of sharing a concern. And he said he knows that sometimes people are worried about the repercussions of coming forward. So the Humane World for Animals is kind of offering a solution to that. A $5,000 reward if this goes to prosecution. So if you just call their tip line and you give them, hey, I think something's happening at my neighbor's house, that's all you have to do. And then $5,000 is yours if they're able to make this case.
Right. It's a $5,000 for a conviction in one of these animal abuse cases, which, again, because of the long time that it takes to get a conviction, delayed gratification. But at the end of the day, a lot of these tips coming in for free. People want this to change and to end. I just think that, for a long time, this kind of stuff has been going on in the background. It's sort of South Carolina's worst kept secret. And it does feel like we're starting to get a handle on it. Hopefully we will continue to combat the issue and someday maybe eliminate it. I know you'll be watching this throughout your career here. One of those issues that I know you've taken a vested interest in. Thank you for your reporting, and we'll look forward to see what comes up next.
Thank you so much.